The meeting in Moscow lasted 6 hours. The meeting in Washington lasted 4 hours. After meeting with the leaders of both superpowers on the same day, Traoré boarded his plane with a smile on his face. The new front of the Cold War begins in Africa, he told his assistant, and this time we will set the rules. Ibrahim Traoré gazed out the window of his presidential aircraft as it reached cruising altitude over the Atlantic below the vast ocean that had once carried enslaved Africans to the Americas. Now carried him between the world's greatest powers, first to Washington, D.C., then to Moscow, and now back to Burkina Faso, all within 72 dizzying hours. Mr. President, his chief of staff, Colonel Issa Ouedraogo, interrupted his thoughts. Our communications team needs your approval for the press release about the meetings. Traoré turned from the window, his expression unreadable. Tell them to say nothing, yet just the standard diplomatic language, productive discussions, mutual understanding, continuing dialogue, no details. But Sir Ouedraogo pressed cautiously. Both the Americans and Russians will release their own statements. Shouldn't we establish our narrative first? A slight smile crossed Traoré's face. Let them speak. Their statements will contradict each other, and both will claim I've aligned with them. That uncertainty is exactly what we need right now. The colonel nodded, though confusion showed in his eye. He had served Traoré loyally since the military transition that brought him to power, but even he wasn't fully briefed on the strategy behind these high-stakes diplomatic maneuvers. As you left to relay the instructions, Traoré opened a secure lap. On the screen were two documents side by side, proposals from the world's military superpowers, each offering billions in aid, military equipment, and resource development in exchange for what they euphemistically called strategic partnership. In reality, both wanted the same thing: exclusive access to Burkina Faso's newly discovered reserves of rare earth minerals, elements crucial for everything from smartphones to fighter jets to renewable energy system. What was once dismissed as worthless African soil was now among the most strategically valuable territory on Earth. The new Cold War Traoré murmured to himself, except this time, Africa isn't just a battleground. This time, we're played. 48 hours earlier, Traoré had sat across from the American president in the Oval Office, Washington's summer heat pressing against the windows despite the building's powerful air conditioning. Let me be direct, Captain Traoré, the American leader had said, dispensing with diplomatic niceties. The minerals in your country are essential to our national security. The processing facilities we're offering to build would create thousands of jobs for your people and generate billions in revenue. And in return, Traoré had asked, though he already knew the answer in return, we ask for exclusive extraction rights and a commitment that you won't allow Chinese or Russian operations in your country. We've also prepared a very generous military aid package: equipment, training, intelligence sharing. The American proposal included $11 billion in direct investment military hardware that Burkina Faso desperately needed to fight extremist insurgencies, and preferential trade status, a comprehensive package designed to bring Burkina Faso firmly into the American sphere of influence. I appreciate your offer. Mr. President Traoré had responded carefully, but Burkina Faso's sovereignty isn't negotiable. Any agreement must respect our right to manage our own resources and determine our own international relationship. The American president's smile had tightened almost imperceptibly, of course, but I should note that our intelligence suggests Russia is preparing a similar offer. Their involvement would bring complications, regional instability, congressional concerns. About our aid packages, you understand the threat beneath the diplomatic language was clear. Choose us exclusively or face the consequences. The meeting in Moscow the following day had been remarkably similar, though, with distinctly Russian characteristics. The setting was more grandiose, the ornate Catherine Hall in the Kremlin, rather than the relatively modest Oval Office. The Russian president had been more direct in his approach. Africa has been exploited by the West for centuries, he had told Trout. First slavery, then colonialism, now economic imperialism disguised as development aid. Russia offers a different path, a true partnership between equal. The Russian proposal, $9 billion in infrastructure development, advanced weapons systems, including air defense capabilities. The Americans had refused to provide in technical assistance for mineral extraction, all without the political conditions that came with the Western support. And your only condition is that we exclude American companies from our resource development, Traoré had asked. The Russian leader had smiled. We merely suggest that those who respect your sovereignty deserve preferential treatment. The Americans will use your minerals to build weapons they would never sell to you. We offer complete technology transfer. You will not just extract these resources, you will learn to process and utilize them yourself. Before leaving, the Russian president had added, remember, Captain Traoré, The Americans see Africa as a resource to be controlled. We see a continent of equals rising to its rightful place in a multipolar world. Now flying back to Burkina Faso, reflected on the similar scripts with different rhetoric. Both superpowers viewed Africa's rare earth minerals as a zero-sum game. Both couched their geopolitical ambitions in the language of partnership and development, and both fundamentally misunderstood the Africa of 2023, a continent increasingly unwilling to be a pawn in great power competition. Sir Colonel Ouedraogo returned with a tablet. We're receiving reports that both Washington and Moscow are claiming successful negotiation. Russian state media is suggesting you've agreed to their proposal. The Americans are hinting the same about theirs. Traoré nodded, unsurprised. And how are markets responding? Share prices for American rare earth processing companies are down. Russian mining conglomerates are seeing similar drops. Everyone's uncertain which way you're leaning. Good Traoré said simply. And are other preparations on schedule? President Gautier of Mali and President Tani of Niger are ready for the summit 3 days from now. The Chinese representative confirmed his attendance as an observer. Our technical teams have completed their assessments of the mineral deposits. Traoré leaned back in his seat. The real gambit, one neither superpower had anticipated, was about to begin 3 days later in a heavily secured conference facility in Ouagadougou. Leaders from the Sahel region gathered for what was publicly described as a regional security cooperation summit. The actual agenda was far more ambitious, gentlemen. Addressed the assembled leaders. For too long, Africa has been treated as a prize to be won in others' competitions during the Cold War. Our resources, our politics, even our civil conflicts were manipulated by external powers pursuing their own interests. On large screens around the room, classified sections of both the American and Russian proposals were displayed side by side. As you can see, despite their opposing geopolitical positions, both offers share one fundamental characteristic: they seek exclusive control, preventing us from developing our own processing capabilities or forming partnerships with other nations. President God of Mali, a fellow military leader who had similarly moved his country away from French influence, leaned forward. And your response to these offers? I haven't given one yet, Traoré replied, which is why both Moscow and Washington are claiming victory in their press briefings. This confusion provides us a critical window of opportunity. He gestured, and the screens changed to display a detailed map of rare earth mineral deposits across the Sahel region, not just in Burkina Faso, but in Mali, Niger, Chad, and several other countries. What neither superpower has fully grasped is the scale of what we collectively possess individually. Each of our countries can be pressured, coerced, or destabilized if we don't comply with external demands together. We control nearly 40% of the world's reserves of these critical minerals. The Chinese observers, silent until now, spoke up, and this is why China has been invited to this discussion as a counterbalance. Traoré shook his head. No, Mr. Jing, with respect, we're not looking to replace one master with another. China's current monopoly on rare earth processing is as problematic as American or Russian control would be. You're here because we're proposing something unprecedented, a multilateral approach that includes all major powers as partners, but with African nations maintaining majority control, he outlined the proposal that his team had been developing for months: the formation of the African Mineral Processing Consortium, AMPC, a transnational entity collectively owned by participating African nations that would control extraction, processing, and export of rare earth mineral. Foreign partners, American, Russian, Chinese, European, would be welcome to invest, provide technology, and purchase outputs, but no single external power would have exclusive access or controlling interest. In simple terms, Traoré concluded, we're ending the bidding war for African resources by refusing to be bid upon. We will process our own minerals, set our own prices, and to negotiate from a position of unified strength. The summit room fell silent as the implications sank in. What Traoré was proposing wasn't just an economic arrangement. It was a fundamental restructuring of geopolitical relationships that had defined Africa since colonial times. President Tani of Niger was the first to speak. The resistance will be significant, not just diplomatic pressure, but potential destabilization efforts, support for opposition groups, perhaps even military intervention disguised as counterterrorism operations. Yes, Traoré acknowledged, which is why the security component of our alliance is equally important. Our combined forces, properly coordinated and equipped, can secure these resources against non-state actors, and the strategic importance of these minerals gives us leverage against state-sponsored interference. The discussion continued for hours, addressing financing mechanisms, technical challenges, security cooperation, and diplomatic strategy. By evening, a framework agreement had been drafted, the Ouagadougou Protocol establishing the foundation for what might become the most significant Pan-African economic initiative since independence. As the summit concluded, the Chinese representative approached True privately. Beijing will not be pleased to lose its processing monopoly, he said bluntly. But there may be room for a special bilateral arrangement between China and Burkina Faso that preserves your leadership's personal interests. The implied bribe was clear. Traoré's response was equally direct. Mr. Zhang, the heroine African leaders could be bought to betray their country's interests is ending. Please convey to Beijing that we seek partners, not patrons. The response from Washington and Moscow came swiftly. As anticipated, both expressed serious concerns about the Ouagadougou Protocol. The American Secretary of State issued a statement questioning the economic viability of African mineral processing. Russian commentators suggested the initiative was secretly backed by Western interests, seeking to undermine Russian-African cooperation. Within days, more concrete pressures emerged. International financial institutions suddenly raised concerns about Burkina Faso's creditworthiness. Intelligence reports indicated increased funding to opposition groups. Military advisors warned of unusual movements by non-state armed groups near key mineral deposit. 10 days after returning from Washington and Moscow, Trump convened his National Security Council in the secure underground facility beneath the presidential palace. The Americans have frozen our accounts in New York, reported Finance Minister Kabor. The Russians have delayed previously agreed weapons shipments. Both claim technical issues, but the timing is obvious. French media is running stories about democratic backsliding in Burkina Faso, added Information Minister Urag Western Nosar, suddenly very concerned about our human rights situation. Traoré listened calmly to each report. The pressure was expected, even welcome in a sense, as it confirmed the superpowers' recognition of what was at stake. And our countermeasures defense minister Zeta outlined the deployment of elite units to secure key mineral sites. Foreign Minister Dira described diplomatic outreach to potential allies: India, Brazil, Turkey, South Africa, nations with their own complex relationships with the great powers and potential interest in breaking monopolistic control of critical resources. Most importantly, Technology Minister Sankarat presented the progress of Burkina Faso's first rare earth processing facility, a pilot project developed quietly over the past year with technical assistance from South Korean experts who had helped their own country break free from dependence on Chinese processing. The facility is small but functional, Sankara explained, enough to demonstrate our capacity and produce samples for potential buyers. We've already received inquiries from Japanese and German manufacturers eager to diversify their supply chain. Trump nodded in satisfaction. The superpowers believe they're calling our bluff. They expect economic pressure to force us back to the negotiating table, willing to accept exclusive terms. When they realize we have alternatives both for processing, technology, and for buyers, their approach will change. The crisis escalated over the following weeks. Western media outlets ran stories questioning the stability of Sahel governments. Humanitarian organizations reported on refugee movements that mysteriously coincided with mineral-rich region. Financial analysts published dire predictions about resource nationalism leading to economic collapse. Then came the most dangerous developments. Satellite imagery revealed unofficial military encampments appearing near Burkina Faso's borders. Mercenary groups with ambiguous backing but sophisticated equipment. The escalation had reached the threshold where many African leaders throughout history had capitulated, accepting unfavorable terms with foreign powers in exchange for security guarantees and personal enrichment. It was a well-established playbook that had kept the continent's resources flowing outward for generations. But Trump had anticipated this phase. While publicly maintaining a calm diplomatic posture, he had spent months preparing alternative security arrangements. Joint military exercises with neighboring countries secured borders. Intelligence sharing with unlikely partners, including Turkey and the United Arab Emirates, provided early warning of mercenary movement. Most surprisingly to foreign observers, Trump leveraged something few had recognized: competition between private military contractors themselves by selectively engaging Russian Wagner Group elements to train Burkina Faso special forces. He effectively deterred Western-linked mercenary operations, creating a security stalemate that foreign powers couldn't easily penetrate. The turning point came for months after the diplomatic whirlwind between Washington and Moscow at a technology exhibition in Seoul. Burkina Faso unveiled the first commercially viable rare earth metals processed entirely in Africa. The samples, neodymium, dysprosium, and other elements crucial for advanced technology, were Small but symbolically enormous. More significant than the materials themselves was the presence of purchasing representatives from major technology manufacturers, companies whose supply chains been completely dependent on Chinese processing and who now saw in the African Mineral Processing Consortium an opportunity to diversify their sources for these critical components. We're not excluding anyone, Traoré told reporters at the exhibition. American companies, European firms, Chinese manufacturers, all are welcome to purchase our processed materials. What we won't accept is monopolistic control of our resources or processing capability. The message was clear. Africa was no longer presenting itself as territory to be claimed in a new Cold War, but as an independent player with its own leverage in the global economy. Gradually, the approach of the superpowers began to shift. The American Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs arrived in Ouagadougou with a revised proposal, still seeking preferential access but no longer demanding exclusivity. Russian negotiators similarly adjusted their position, emphasizing technology transfer rather than control. Even China, recognizing the threat to its processing monopoly, engaged more constructively, offering to invest in larger-scale African facilities as a minority partner. 6 months after his diplomatic gambit between Moscow and Washington, Ibrahim Traoré stood at the opening ceremony of the first major rare earth processing facility in Burkina Faso. Around him were leaders from across the Sahel, representatives from technology companies spanning 4 continents, and diplomatic envoys from global powers who had been forced to reassess their approach to African resources. The old Cold War treated Africa as a chessboard where superpowers moved their pieces, Traoré said. In his address, villages became pawns, nations became squares to be captured, and African resources fueled conflicts we did not create for purposes that did not benefit our people. He gestured to the modern facility behind him, a complex of buildings that would process the minerals that powered smartphones, electric vehicles, renewable energy systems, and advanced military technology. This facility represents a new paradigm. We are not aligning with East or West. We are not choosing sides in others' geopolitical competitions. Instead, we are choosing ourselves, our development, our sovereignty, our future. The international press dubbed it resource diplomacy, a strategy that leveraged Africa's natural wealth, not just for economic gain, but to fundamentally alter geopolitical relationships. Political scientists noted similarities to OPEC's transformation of oil politics in the butt, with a critical distinction. While OPEC controlled extraction, the African Mineral Processing Consortium controlled both extraction and processing, the critical value-added step that had historically taken place outside Africa. In Washington, Moscow, and Beijing, intelligence agencies and policy think tanks scrambled to update their assessments of African relations. The assumption that African nations could be pressured, bribed, or coerced into exclusive arrangements was being challenged by a new generation of leaders who understood the strategic value of their resources in an increasingly resource-constrained world. For Ibrahim Traoré, the success of his dangerous balancing act between superpowers was measured not in geopolitical terms, but in the practical outcomes for his people. The processing facility employed thousands directly, with thousands more in supporting industry revenue from mineral exports, now capturing the full value chain rather than merely the raw extraction. Funded schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. Most importantly, the regional security cooperation necessitated by the Mineral Consortium had reduced the influence of extremist groups that had plagued the Sahel for decades by removing the possibility of superpowers supporting different factions. To secure resource access, Traoré had inadvertently created conditions for greater stability. 1 year after his marathon diplomacy between Washington and Moscow, Traoré welcomed a delegation of young engineering students to the presidential palace. They were the first graduates of the new Technical Institute of Mineral Science, trained specifically for management and operations of the processing facilities. You, he told them, represent the true victory in our resource diplomacy, not the buildings, not the international agreements, but the knowledge and capability now embedded in our people. A young woman raised her hand. Mr. President, our instructors taught us about the diplomatic crisis last year, how you leveraged superpower competition to secure our independence. Weren't you concerned about the risks, the potential for conflict or regime change? Traoré considered the question carefully. Of course, throughout African history, leaders who challenged external control of resource have faced severe consequence, but there was a greater risk in continuing the old pattern, allowing our critical minerals to become the prize in a new Cold War, with our people caught in the middle. He paused, then added, the Cold War never truly ended. For Africa, it simply changed form. Foreign powers continued to compete for our resources, support different factions in our conflicts, and ensure we remained providers of raw materials, rather than participants in the value chain by refusing to choose sides by making all powers compete on our terms. Instead, we've begun to change that fundamental dynamic as the students departed. Traoré's chief of staff approached with a tablet displaying breaking news. Another African nation had announced the discovery of significant rare earth deposits and requested membership in the consortium. The economic and geopolitical model pioneered in Burkina Faso was spreading. The Americans are calling, Ouedraogo said, and the Russians and the Chinese all want to discuss partnership opportunities with the expanded consortium. Traoré smiled, slightly scheduled calls with all of them the same day. Back to back, the strategy that began as a desperate gambit was now a position of strength. The new front of the Cold War had indeed begun in Africa, but for the first time, Africans were writing the rules of engagement in his private journal that evening. Traoré wrote a reflection that would later be cited in international relations. Textbooks superpowers think in terms of global chessboards, with countries as pieces to be captured or controlled. Africa's future depends on our ability to stop being pieces in their game and start being players in our own right. The Cold War had returned to Africa, but this time, Africa had returned the favor, transforming great power competition from a threat into an opportunity, leveraging geopolitical rivalry into developmental advantage through a dangerous but ultimately successful balancing.